So tonight we're going to be looking at Marvin Cohn's Lafayette Farm from 1942. And this is a work I chose specifically because it is a work that is on view right now, and you can see it. It is in the gallery that we have dedicated to Marvin Cohn's work. Many people know the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art for having the largest collection of works by Grant Wood, and we do, but we also have the world's largest collection of works by his best friend Marvin Cohn. And so we are featuring a work that you can see on view in the gallery dedicated to him. But I chose Lafayette Farm because it is primarily a representation of a barn, and it coincides with a recently owned exhibition, a recently opened exhibition that our curator Julia Jessen put together called Barnstorm. Picturing an American icon. And what Julia did in that exhibition was go through our collection of American art, which is the primary focus of our collection, and look at images of barns as they are depicted by a variety of artists. And so that's a really interesting exhibition that recently opened. Julia purposely did not include a work in that exhibition by Marvin Cohn. Marvin Cohn is well known for having done multiple images of barns, and I'll share some of those with you this evening. And it's almost sort of expected in some ways that Marvin Cohn would be in that show. But because of that expectation, Julia was careful to sort of not include him in that exhibition, because you can see a wonderful example of his barn work in the exhibition that we have dedicated to Marvin Cohn's work, that being Lafayette Farm. And so I wanted to kind of take the spotlight, kind of keeping Barnstorm in mind, take the spotlight and look at some of those wonderful representations of Marvin Cohn's work in subject matter, in this particular subject matter. And so we're going to be looking at Marvin Cohn's barn. The images I'm going to share with you are, by and large, all works that come from our own collection. As I mentioned, we have an extensive collection of works by Marvin Cohn, and barns were a significant part of that, of his creative output, and I'm going to be sharing with you our wonderfully rich holdings of representations of barns and farms by Marvin Cohn. But before I delve into looking at Lafayette Farm, I always presume that our attendees know a bit about Marvin Cohn, and that's probably not wise for me to assume that people know Marvin Cohn. I've had the pleasure of working with his work for the last 20 years now here at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, so I know a lot about him, but I cannot or should not presume that others do. So I'm going to give you a very brief biography of Marvin Cohn, so you kind of set the setting biographically for what you're going to see. So he was born, as I mentioned earlier, on October 21st in 1891 here in Cedar Rapids. The only son of Gertrude Dorrit Cohn and Harry DeForest Cohn. In 1906, he graduated from Adams Elementary School, where Grant Wood was a fellow classmate and close friend, so close friend from elementary school on. In 1910, they both graduate from Washington High School. In 1914, Marvin graduates magna cum laude from Coe College with a BS degree. He moves to Chicago to study at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. 3 years later, in 1917, he exhibits some of his cloud paintings. He's already becoming well known for his cloud paintings, which is another major area of production for him. He exhibits some of his cloud paintings in the St. Paul Institute's third annual exhibition of the work of Northwestern artists. He returns to Cedar Rapids in May of 1917 and enlists in World War I. He trains in Camp Cody in Deming, New Mexico. The following year, in 1918, after training, he accompanies Brigadier General Hubert Allen of Cedar Rapids to France as a French interpreter. In 1919, at the conclusion of the war, Marvin Cohn stays on for a few months and studies from March until June at the École des Beaux-Arts in Montpellier, France. He begins teaching French at Coe College upon his return to Cedar Rapids, and that same year exhibits 31 paintings in the picture galleries of Killian's company, which is Killian's department store here in Cedar Rapids. Following year in 1920, he returns to France with his good friend, Grant Wood, where they spend the summer. They come back to the Cedar Rapids by way of Antwerp aboard the SS Grampian, where he meets Winifred Swift, who was to become his wife the following year. He exhibits 30 pictures in the ship's salon and subsequently at the Cedar Rapids Art Association in that same year. As I mentioned, the following year, 1921, he marries Winifred Swift. In the following year, in 1922, their daughter, Doris Elaine, is born. In 1923, he moves to Fifth Avenue here in Cedar Rapids. And later in that decade, in 1929, Marvin and Winifred travel to Paris, which is financed by a subscription of 20 community patrons. He exhibits the results of that trip to France in the Little Gallery of the Cedar Rapids Art Association later that same year. In 1931, he wins the Thompson Prize from the Iowa Artists Club annual exhibition for his painting Studio Corner, which the museum owns and is also on view in the Marvin Cohn Gallery. In 1932, he teaches life drawing and landscape painting at the Stone City Art Colony. In 1934, he is officially appointed professor of drawing and painting at Coe College. When he started at Coe College, he was teaching French. There was no art department. He basically creates the art department while he is there. But he is officially appointed in 1934 as the professor of drawing and painting at Coe, and he serves in that capacity until 1960. In 1935, he's awarded the Sweepstakes Prize at the Iowa State Fair. In 1938-39, he takes a leave of absence from Coe College to pursue painting. He establishes a studio in the Granby building here in downtown Cedar Rapids. And as a part of that sabbatical, if you will, they didn't officially have sabbaticals at the time, but as a part of that leave of absence, he spends 5 weeks in Mexico. And then the sales from his year off, if you will, net him $4,000, which is equivalent to about $93,000 today. So it was very, very good opportunity for him when he took some time off to paint for sort of all day for a year. He maintains his Granby studio for about 2 years after that because, again, as a nascent art department, there really weren't studios yet for the art faculty at Coe College, and so he was maintaining his own studio at the Granby. In 1940, Old Iowa Barn is included in the Midwestern Artist Exhibitions at the Kansas City Art Institute. In 1941, From Iowa is included in the 136th Annual Exhibition of Paintings and Sculpture at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia. And in 1943, Layfayette Farm, the piece that we're going to be looking at today, is included in the 117th Annual Exhibition of Paintings and Sculpture at the National Academy of Design in New York. Many people locally know about Marvin Cohn, but what people maybe do not realize, and I'm showing you several images of Marvin Cohn by Marvin Cohn right now on the screen. What people don't know is that Marvin Cohn was extremely successful artist during his lifetime. He exhibited widely across the country. He was included in a number of very, very important exhibitions and was well known in his lifetime. He did not have that Grant Wood American Gothic moment, but he was a well-established and highly successful artist who, after his passing, his reputation faded. And so people do not know the name Marvin Cohn today as much as people might know the name Grant Wood today. But he was extremely accomplished and successful artist during his lifetime and was accepted in many very important exhibitions. And amongst them is this piece, Layfayette Farm, from 1942, which is the topic of today's One Night Stand. You can see it's a largely horizontal piece, 16 by 40 inches. This comes from the Turners, who were the source of most of our really sort of early premier works by Grant Wood. They also collected some works by Marvin Cohn. This is one of those works that came out of that collection. I like to have a title slide which tells you kind of the dimensions and the materials as well as the source of the work. But then I also like these a little bit larger images so you get a better look at the painting. So in most every case that I show you this evening, there'll be both a smaller and a larger image of the same piece that you can get a little bit better look at that. I certainly encourage you to come look at this piece in person at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art. It really is a stunning piece. This reproduction here on the screen does fair justice to it, but it is really much more of a luminous piece in person. Here you see a wonderful, really kind of portrait of a barn, if you will. You see the farmhouse, you see the road to the left and the farmhouse there, and you see the woman, presumably the farmer's wife, hanging laundry on the line. You see the entire composition, however, is dominated by the barn. It really is the focus of the composition. You see that there are animals in there, a mixture of animals, sheep with pigs, with chickens, all in sort of this farmyard. Interestingly, at this time, both Marvin Cohn and Grant Wood, and I dare say other artists too, would oftentimes include the fence posts, but not the barbed wire. I suppose the barbed wire would have been visually very distracting to draw all those lines in, but you can see here in the foreground really those posts, and I think it is left to the viewer to imagine perhaps that there was barbed wire, although you do see one chicken that has kind of escaped that holding. So I'm sure that there were farms that had fence posts without barbed wire, but it is interesting how many compositions that both Marvin Cohn and Grant Wood do that there are fence posts but no wire. And I can't imagine all of these farms had no barbed wire. I think visually, personally, I think visually it might have been somewhat of distracting to put that kind of detail in. But the painting is loaded with all sorts of other details. And I took a few detail shots. You can see in a shot like this exactly how thinly Marvin Cohn painted. You can really see the texture of the canvas underneath it. But that's not the point of this detail. I wanted to kind of give a detail of the left-hand side of the composition where you see the farmhouse and wonderful details here of the woman with her basket of laundry, hanging up this laundry, incredibly white sheets or white garments here. She must have worked very hard to get those sheets very white, pristine white, if you will. They almost glow. I mean, they're whiter than the house, okay, and they're even whiter than the chickens. I mean, they really are brilliantly white. Here, a close-up of the farmyard here with the posts. In the foreground, and then a whole series of buildings, and I think throughout, as we look at these details, you see how there are variations in color. There are planks of wood that are well painted. There are planks of wood that are worn. There are windows that are missing panes. There are windows that are ajar. There are doors missing. There's all kinds of wonderful anecdotal details. Marvin Cohn was masterful at painting the barn. And he and Winifred, his wife, would go out and they would drive around the Iowa countryside looking for somewhat time-weathered barns that had a lot of personality. And when he would find one, it oftentimes became sort of the subject of the composition. He really found a lot of character. And he's not painting brand new barns. He's not painting brand new farms. He's not, in a way, he's kind of looking back at kind of those strong, still standing barns that sort of have stood the test of time. In the same way, Grant Wood oftentimes looks back in his compositions to a time before the time in which he's creating it. Here to the right-hand side, a wonderful profile of a pig, and these really quite high bales of hay here, or piles of hay here. They're almost a story and a half high. They're really wonderful, large mounds, beautifully realized in light and shade, and they successfully close off the composition on the right-hand side, focusing your view really on all that's happening in the foreground, which is sort of the point of the composition. Here, back to the left-hand side, a look at his clouds. Marvin Cohn was a masterful painter of clouds. Sometimes, they really dominate the composition. It's really more of a cloudscape than a landscape. And he was recognized very early on, even before his barns. He was recognized for several cloud studies that he did. They were some of the earliest pieces that were accepted into juried competitions. And here, wonderfully feathery trees that you see here. I mean, Marvin Cohn began very much like Grant Wood did as an American Impressionist. And that's where he kind of got his start before he kind of, I think, found his own voice. And in both the case of Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn, you will see that they never really leave Impressionism completely behind. Oftentimes you will find references to it in their more mature work. This dates, from the 1940s. By and large, Marvin has left American Impressionism behind in his work, but there are telltale signs such as this wonderfully feathery tree that I think sort of bespeaks to his earlier interest in American Impressionism. But really, like Grant Wood, the focus of these later compositions is really is always through both their Impressionist phase and then their more sort of mature styles, is always really about light and shadow. And that tends to be really something that you see pervasive throughout both artists' career, is their interest in light and shadow. They treat it one way when they're working in the Impressionism vernacular, but then they treat it another way when they're working in their more mature styles. Here another view, and you can also see a little bit of that Impressionism with the trees, but also in the foreground. I mean, one of the interesting things that Marvin Cohn does a lot in his compositions, his landscape compositions, especially these of his farms and barns, is that there will oftentimes be a very interesting shadow cast, and yet the source of that shadow might be unknown. So in this case, on the left-hand side of the composition, and this is the left section of the left-hand side there, you see the shadow cutting across the dirt road. It is being caused by some tree that you see sort of off stage. You don't get to see it at all. It's casting the shadow because of the way the sun is obviously coming from the left. So it's something that's causing that shadow, but he uses this quite a bit in his compositions, and they add an extraordinary amount of visual interest to the painting. It's one of those things that once you see it in a work by Marvin Cohn, you see it time and time again. So we're going to go backtrack in time here a little bit to kind of provide some context for Layfayette Farm. And so I'm going to go back to a very early work here from 1909. It's a small work. It's only 6 by 8 inches, oil on canvas, and he's a young artist. Born in 1891, so he's like all of 18 years old here. So he's a young artist, and this is not so much a barn as it is a farmhouse and a farm scene with a whole series of other farm outbuildings that you see here. And it's again a very early work for him, but it betrays an interest at a very early point in his career in images of the farm and the barn. Here a much closer view of it. There are figures in them, but they're in the center there, but they're barely noticeable. They're really not about the figures. The palette is extremely limited. It's almost a tonalist kind of work where he's really limited the palette completely. But it's an interesting point of departure in Marvin Cohn's career in looking at this particular subject matter. Here from just a couple years later, an interesting pencil and crayon sketch. Also a very small work. This would be more sort of a reference piece for him. And here you see sort of kind of a very tall silo-like structure with a pointed roof there, and kind of a barn attachment to the back side of it. Not exactly sure where he is, and we know that he's doing it in March of 1911, because he clearly marks that on the sheet of paper. And I think it was just a wonderful little sketch. You can see even here, he's very interested in light and shadow, and how light and shadow picks out volumes. Whenever we look at Marvin Cohn's barns and series of farm structures, oftentimes adjacent to each other, he's really investigating an intersection of planes, intersection of these forms, and we see that more clearly in these. We see them clearly in these early works, but we see him continue to build upon those as he goes forward. In 1919, as I mentioned, he was studying after the war at the École des Beaux-Arts in Montpellier, France. This is probably a work from that time. It is a smaller piece, but it clearly dates from that moment in time. It was probably because of its smallness. It's probably something he did right on site. He found a French farm, started painting sort of the buildings, whether that's the house or whether that's the barn itself. Oftentimes those things were merged in a lot of farms in Europe. The house and you would store down below and you would live up above, or vice versa. And here it's just a sketch, a small little sketch while on board of this really wonderful sort of scenic pastoral view of France. Montpellier is in southern France, not far from the Mediterranean. And he was there for about 4 months after the war, before coming back to Cedar Rapids. This image, unfortunately, has quite a bit of glare on it, so you kind of have to kind of remove that as you look at it. But again, he's very interested, much more impressionistic. This is earlier in his career. He's very interested in light and shadow throughout all of this, and that remains even though his style changes. Here, a bit later, from 1938, so we kind of jump a little bit forward in time, much closer in time to Layfayette Farm. We see this pencil sketch, not super big, but a wonderful pencil sketch. Get a little bit larger image of it here, because it is a fairly pale piece, so it's a little bit hard to see. And he's, again, really looking at, there is a small farmhouse to the far right, but that's not the subject of the composition. It really is these wonderful series of farm buildings, the barns and multiple barns, and how they all sort of affix to one another. And again, about light and shadow, how the bright sunlight is really picking out the forms and casting dark shadows on other forms. And that's how you're sort of reading all of these different forms. Unfortunately, this drawing has some pretty awful matte burn on it due to prolonged exposure. So this was at one time matted up to just sort of highlight or focus on the structures itself, and over time that has left a matte burn on the paper. Somewhat similar is this barn scene from around the same period of time. It's not the same piece at all, but again, Cohn is very interested in this sort of massing of forms of these blocky farm structures, and sort of how they are all sort of interrelated to each other, how they create this sort of compound of various buildings that all have different functions but are all vital to the functioning of the farm. Here, a smaller work, already sort of exploring what the horizontal format will allow him. Again, sort of this sort of hybrid piece. There are elements of it that are impressionistic, and then there are other elements of it that are moving away from impressionism and really exploring a much tighter edge style. Here, a closer view at it. Again, with a little bit of glare, I'm afraid, because Marvin Cohn painted so thinly. Oftentimes when his works are being photographed, Yeah, the lighting has to be just perfect, or else you're going to pick up this glare, and if not the glare, then you're going to pick up the weave of the canvas. So they are wonderful to experience in person, but they are particularly difficult to capture on film. For the following year, Old Iowa Barn. This is one of the works that I referenced in my biographical introduction. This was included in the Kansas City Art Institute exhibition from 1940, so the following year. This is one of those quintessential time-worn barns that Marvin Cohn really sought out when he would travel throughout Iowa. You can see that it has seen better days. It is in need of some love, to say the least. It dominates the composition. I mean, really, it really blocks you from going much further back into space. I mean, you can kind of creep around a little bit on the right-hand side, but then you run into another farm building. So you really can't get too far out. There are these wonderful sort of chickens in the foreground. You can see here this sort of residue of another sort of structure that was attached to the barn but no longer exists, but has caused the barn coloring to change, having been sort of painted around that now no longer extant structure. And he's really capturing the personality of the barn. It really becomes a portrait, I think, of the barn. In much the same way that if you had a human sitter in front of you, and you depicted them, that you would try to capture their personality. And I think that's what he's doing very successfully with these barns. Again, visual interest. Marvin has these wonderful shadows in the foreground that are being cast by something behind you. Behind you is the viewer. Something is casting those shadows, and something to your left and to your right behind you are casting those wonderful shadows. It, like I said, adds a great deal of visual interest to the composition. And here a much larger and closer view of it. You can see, again, elements that are still fairly painterly, fairly loosely put down, and then others that are much more pristine and harder edged. You can see he is a master of detail, and in this composition, it really gives you the full sense of what he's seeing in front of him. Composition like this, which is a little bit larger, he would probably have done a small study in person and probably worked it up, in the studio. Here from 1940, from the next year, a wonderful little drawing in ink on poster board, fairly good sized. It's hard to say how it was being used, but to do ink on poster board kind of harkens back to media that Marvin Cohn used back when he was contemplating being an illustrator. One of the options he had after the war was to become an illustrator, or alternatively to teach French at Coe College. He chose to teach French, but he considered commercial illustration, as many artists did in the day, as a way to make a living with his artistic talent. And so he did several ink on kind of poster board works. Then here, much later, this may have been something that he created to be used. This obviously was a study for Cook's Barn, as the title indicates, which is another painting. But why he chose to do it in ink on poster board, it might have had another purpose as well. Here, again, you see this wonderful foreground, which is kind of a pen for the animals, and then sort of really the outline in many ways, kind of almost a silhouette of the barn itself, with these wonderful, linear clouds in the sky above. Here a little bit closer view of it. You can see he's really, just as he was a master of paint, he was also a master of line, pen and ink and pencil and charcoal. From Iowa in 1940. This is the work that was included at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia show of the following year in 1941. This also came from John B. Turner II. Here, again, sort of this wonderful view of a farm, really dominated by farm buildings. There is a farmhouse in the background, very large bale of hay to the right-hand side, again, kind of closing off the composition there. And in the very, very sort of foreground, you see another shadow that's being cast by something we can't see, and that shadow continues, and it actually, there's a shadow on the hay bale as well. So something is casting that shadow, probably, perhaps a grove of trees, something like that, although it feels like it's a fairly sharp shadow, so I'm not quite sure exactly what is casting that shadow. Again, series of fence posts without barbed wire. Maybe it was, maybe it never had barbed wire. Maybe it had barbed wire and no longer does. But it is something that one sees fairly frequently in Marvin Cohn's landscapes, but in particular his images of the barn, as you see here, and a little bit closer view of it, although this image is slightly blurry. So it's not quite as soft as you may be seeing on your screen. It's a little bit sharper in person. And from 1941, another drawing, small study entitled Barn Scene, again, really focusing on the barn. Here you get a sense of his real sort of crisp, clean, linear style here, but still continues to be fascinated by light and shadow. Here you can see he's also drawing in a way that the texture of the paper's coming through, and again you see unfortunately a fairly significant matte burn around the image of the composition as well. And then this is where Layfayette Farm fits. So next in line would be something like Layfayette Farm. Again, we discussed a nice sort of overall view here. The viewer does come in either by way of the road or by way of the pen holding all of the animals, and the composition really is dominated by this massing of farm buildings. All sort of, working in tandem with each other to create this really incredible mound, if you will, of architecture, all of which serves critical functions in the operation of a farm, but really become their own entities. It's almost really a study of intersecting planes. And that's something that we see later in Marvin Cohn's work when he explores his series of paintings of doors and stairs and so forth. I wanted to move a little bit forward because he didn't stop painting barns with Layfayette Farm. He continued to paint them. They were a major part of his career. They were in very high demand. People would write to him asking for images of barns. Here, Otis Tuttle's barn, which was a real barn that Marvin Cohn saw and painted. You can see it's in a great state of dilapidation there. It's been a little bit time weathered. Again, a love of light and shadow that realizes the form. It doesn't have a whole lot of additional farm buildings, but there are a few in there, but it really is sort of the same sort of thing. The barn really stops you from going very far off into space. You do get little snippets on both the left and the right of the distant landscape. And he wasn't as if he was afraid to paint the distant landscape. I've got some examples coming up, but he really wants to focus your attention on the barn itself. And you can see how this silo crafts this wonderful, wonderful shadow across the barn itself. And then in 1953, his study for Red Barn, a fairly sizable work, 3 feet wide, and it to me, in person, it's almost as if the barn has a halo. The way Marvin Cohn has treated the sky, a cloudless sky, but there is a lightness around the silhouette of the barn, and it almost looks like a halo. In many ways, I think this progression of Marvin Cohn's investigation in barns is moving towards what he sees as really kind of a holy symbol of the Midwest, something that is holy, something that is revered, that takes on its own special, almost religious connotation. I'm not saying that that was his intention, but when I look at this particular piece in person, I cannot help but be struck by the way he has treated the sky around the barn, and then it almost takes on a halo-like feel about it. Here again, wonderful massing of forms, wonderful anecdotal details with missing window panes. You're really not allowed to go very much further back into space here. He really wants to concentrate your focus on the barn itself. Here's Study for Toddville Barn from 1953, again with the unfortunate mat burn on it. I mean, many of Marvin Cohn's drawings were framed up and were in the house and in the studio. And then when they came to us, we got them out of those mats, and they were, some of them unfortunately had mat burns from being on exposure. But the fact that they were matted and framed and on view in Cohn's environment speaks volumes. He really, these were really, really important compositions to him, and he continued to study them. Here you can see he has drawn, lines across the drawing that he would then translate these different parts to the larger composition, to the canvas. And use this as a way of translating from this drawing, which was probably his first, or one of the first things he did, was a drawing to the eventual canvas composition. And I included just a couple of fun little barnyard scenes that are undated, animals in conjunction with various farm and barn buildings. And then later, one of the last sort of images that he does with barns and farms dates from 1957. Marvin Cohn passes away in 1963. He retires, 65, excuse me, I don't know why I said 65. He retires from Coe College in 60, resident artist in 61, 62. So this is later, and as he gets later in his career, he begins to explore abstraction. And we have some wonderful examples of his abstract works on view in the Cohn Gallery here. And he begins to explore abstraction also as it pertains to barns. And so this is a very hard composition to see because it is fairly pale and doesn't photograph very well. But I've zoomed in as close as I might. And what you see is kind of a house and barn structure in the top image, where he's kind of fractured it and he's moving it in sort of to abstraction. And in a way, it's absolutely related to all of the other barn images that he did, because he's continuing this exploration of forms, of intersecting planes, of massing, and he's still interested in light and shadow. Even in these abstracted compositions. The one below that is even more abstracted. And it is also sort of where you've taken almost a barn and broken it apart and put it back together again in some ways. He's really, really exploring abstraction. And in all of Marvin Cohn's abstract work, there is some sort of external reference in the natural world. It's not surprising that since barns were a major part of his output, that he would he would explore the abstract qualities that the barns could provide for him compositionally. Works such as this make me think of works that another artist created. This is Charles Sheeler. This is not a piece in our collection, but Charles Sheeler in almost the same time in 1949 is doing compositions like this, which is sort of barns and houses where he's kind of fractured them and kind of put them back together again. Now, Sheeler also begins, just as Marvin Cohn did, in a very, very naturalistic way. Here's the Bucks County barn from 1932, from a decade and a half earlier, and you can see in some ways it looks a lot like Marvin Cohn's earlier barns. Here maybe a little bit more pristine and distilled. There is wear on the roof of the building in the foreground here. But the lines are extraordinarily precise and very, very hard-edged. And we see that in many Marvin Cohn's works, but maybe not to this specific degree. So Sheeler also kind of begins in this sort of naturalistic vein and then sort of explores the possibilities of abstraction so that he becomes known well for these kind of compositions such as this, where he's taking various structures and breaking them apart and putting them back together again. So some of Marvin Cohn's explorations of abstractions of barns makes me think of some of Charles Sheeler's compositions that are happening at about the same time. Marvin Cohn ends up going totally abstract here, although there are, as I said, always some sort of natural reference to him. I'm showing you this particular composition. It doesn't date much later. That abstracted drawing was from 53. 53, I think it was 53. No, 57. I stand corrected. It was 57. This from 2 years later. And this is a golden object suspended. And I wanted to show this one to you because there's an art historian, John Neff, who wrote about Marvin Cohn in an essay. And in the essay, he makes reference to this piece and its potential relationship to Marvin Cohn's barns. And he says, I'm going to quote him here. I understand these special paintings as Cohn's means to remind himself and his viewers of the strong continuities that underlie his late work, sometimes literally. For instance, isn't that golden object in Cohn's Golden Object Suspended, 1959, one of his Iowa barns in silhouette, hiding in plain sight? Are the angled glowing lines drawn from his interior doors and staircases? Even the dark background seems to be a close valued pattern of Cohn's clouds. I thought, what an interesting interpretation of this particular piece, Golden Object Suspended. You do kind of get a sense of some of these kind of the silhouette, that kind of peaking that one sees in a lot of Marvin Cohn's barns in this actual golden object. And Neff is absolutely right. That background is somewhat reminiscent of Marvin Cohn's compositions of clouds. So it's interesting to see kind of this where Marvin Cohn is going with his barns and where that and how he can take that all the way to abstraction. I did want to show this late composition from 1959. And it's a very different way of looking at the barn. You know, the examples I've been sharing with you to this point have really been where the barn is the focus, oftentimes blocking your view to look back into space. Well, at the same time, Marvin Cohn is also exploring using the barn and the farm in the greater landscape, where it is a player in a much larger composition. It's not the composition itself, but it's a player in the larger composition. Sometimes it marks space. It gives you some sense of perspective. And so here, in this late work from 59, Rolling Country, Iowa, it is really about the rolling hills of Iowa. That really is the subject matter here. But, you know, and when one looks at the rolling hills of Iowa, one oftentimes does find a barn nestled in here and there. And so Marvin Cohn was careful to include the wonderful composition of a barn and another farm building in sort of that sort of near middle ground of the composition. You can see a little bit better here. but really it is sort of a bit player, if you will, in the overall composition. Now, it's not as if he comes to this only in 1959. It is something he's been exploring at the same time that he's been exploring these portraits of barns. So in a composition such as River Bend No. 5, which is also in our collection and also currently on view, you can see this really is about River Bend, the bend of the river, a composition inspired by his travels around Cedar Rapids to see the rolling hills of Iowa. You've got some sheep in the foreground, and then you have the middle ground. But then towards the back, you have a lovely little barn nestled in amongst the trees there. And this is, again, a work that is currently on view in the Marvin Cohn Gallery. You can take a close look at it here. And you can see that the barn and the farm here plays a completely different role than it does in a composition like Lafayette Farm. But these are explorations that Marvin Cohn is doing at the same time. Here, a study for river bluffs, very similar in some ways to River Bend No. 5, a pencil on paper, and here sort of you see both sort of in the middle ground, but also in the distance, barn and farm structures. Or here, River Bend No. 4, which is not in our collection, but an image from when it was up for sale at Sotheby's, and from 1938. And here you can see the barn and the farmhouse are important players in the overall composition, but not the total subject matter. Here from 1942, so really about the same time as Lafayette Farm, a representation of Iowa landscape, again, posts, some cultivated land, some trees, and then a sprinkling in the middle and distance of various farm structures, including barns. A little bit closer view here. And that brings us back really to Lafayette Farm, and I hope that sort of looking at both early contemporaneous and later works that focus on the barn and the farm were helpful to providing some sort of context to this particular piece. It really is kind of a quintessential barn image, which is why we have it on view currently, and really kind of stands for the whole series of barns. And I hope that you, in kind of going through many of the barn images that we have in our collection, but currently not on view, gives you a sense of how important this subject matter was to Marvin Cohn, how he revisited it many times throughout his career, and how it changed and evolved during the course of that career. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and let me know what questions you might have.
Hi, Sean, it's Vernell, and I'm battling a cold, so I sound horrible, but I did put a comment in the chat about barbed wire, and how many farmers, I believe, donated barbed wire, scrap metals, stuff like that to the war effort. So that might be why we don't see it in those compositions from the late 30s, early 40s. But I agree with you that it could be an aesthetic choice, especially in those earlier paintings. Which, I mean, an interesting aesthetic choice, especially maybe not so much for Marvin, but for Grant. I mean, farm boy here. I mean, anyway, just a thought, but there you go. It's in the comment or in the chat as well.
Well, thank you. First of all, you don't sound that bad, so you must be on the mend, I hope. But that's an interesting idea. It had not occurred to me. I mean, yeah, certainly, once, we were involved in the war, metal was very, very important. And so that makes a lot of sense that might have been donated to it. But there are, as you pointed out, there are a few earlier compositions where you don't see it. I don't think we will ever know, why it was not included in these compositions. It is interesting that that one does see it also in Grant Wood's work. For example, there's wonderful posts in Young Corn that have no wire on them at all. However, later, if you will, when he's doing his lithographs, and the lithograph for January, you see a horse in the winter with a post, and the barbed wire is front and center, and it's very important compositionally in that particular piece. So I really don't know. I mean, I've always just been wondering and kind of supposing that it might have been a distraction to have something that was that minute of detail, but you're right, there could have been other factors, such as the war effort, that could have played a role in it. But it is interesting how frequently it recurs. I see or smell a PhD dissertation out there somewhere, where someone can investigate, because it's certainly not just going to be Marvin Cohn and Grant Wood. It's going to be a little bit wider than that. But I do know, given our holdings of both of those artists, you do see it frequently in both of those artists' work.
Sean, I really appreciate you pointing out the halo effect on that one bard and how fascinating. I like that. I like that interpretation of it, like that. And once you said halo, I start seeing maybe a cornet of the nun's habit, the cornet. You know, it's fascinating to bring that up. Was Cohn a churchgoer or do you know anything about his religious?
I do not know, but I would hazard a guess, yes. But I do not know that for a fact. But I want to say yes. I want to say somewhere I read a long time ago, and it escapes me now, that he was, part of a congregation of some sort. And I'm sure it's findable, but I don't know.
Well, his church of the Midwest is marvelous little thought there. I like it.
Yeah. So I want to say yes, that he was part of some formalized religion, but I think his love, of the Iowa landscape, of his love of the barn, his love of all of the subject matters he tackled, really, I think that in some way was where that fed his soul. I mean, I think that was, where was spiritual for him, and I think it shows in his work. Any other questions? Well, if not, I thank you for joining me this evening. I hope I provided you some visual context for this magnificent painting. I do invite you to come take a look at it in person, and you can also see River Bend number 5 right next to it. On the other side of it is a fabulous cloudscape with a little church in the landscape, and you can even see Studio Corner on view. It's really remarkable to see these works in person, and I encourage you to do so. Please join us again next month when we will look at a different work by an artist for one night. I appreciate you joining me this evening, and I wish you a good rest of your evening. Thank you.